Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to look at Chapter 19, Section 4, Indian Peoples in Retreat. This coincides with pages 557 to 561 in our textbook. And our essential question is, what happened to the way of life for most Native American tribes in America? So we're going to be looking at what some of the things that transpired throughout the mid to late 1800s to push the Native Americans out of their homelands or to change their way of life. And so our key terms for today are reservation, Fort Laramie Treaty, the Sioux War, the Ghost Dance, and we'll end today talking about the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, before we begin today, I'm going to bring up a list of questions that I want you to copy down. And these are the questions I want you to copy down either onto a sheet of paper or you can copy them into a Word document. And make sure that you keep those answers because you will need them to help you study for the upcoming quizzes and tests. And also it'll help you to know what we're talking about today and kind of follow along through through our lesson today. And we're going to also do you remember this picture? Well, today we're finally going to talk about what led to this image, and as a time period in history that, depending on who you ask, was it was either a very brutal time or a time that was necessary. But regardless, this is what we'll be talking about today. Promises made and broken. Now, how important is your home? Specifically, like your house, the land you live on. Now, if someone came in and told you that your home no longer belonged to you, how would you feel? What would be your reaction? Well, for Native Americans, they had been moved from their traditional homelands and promised lands further west, but as we've seen in the previous few lessons, those lands were only promised until somebody else wanted them, which would lead to conflict over that land. And this was starting really in about the 1840s. Fights would break out when miners and settlers would cross into Indian lands. And these settlers wanted protection. So in 1851, a treaty was drawn up near Fort Laramie, Wyoming, which is pictured right here, known as the Fort Laramie Treaty. And this treaty was between Indian officials and the U.S. government, and it was asking the various nations to keep to smaller areas of land, so to kind of limit the amount of land that they would live on in exchange for domestic animals, agricultural tools, money, and other goods. And a big piece of this treaty was that this land that the Native Americans were promised was promised to them forever. So if they were to move on to these smaller areas of land, they could have that land forever. So the Fort Laramie Treaty was agreed upon, so this is 1851. But in 1858, gold was discovered at Pikes Peak in Colorado, so miners rushed to lands that had been promised to the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations in the Fort Laramie Treaty. So a new treaty was drawn up that would give the settlers the land around Pikes Peak, but this time more Indians disagreed with the treaty and attacked white settlers. Now, do you think that they were right in attacking the settlers? Do you think the settlers were right in claiming those lands in the first place? These are questions that you need to keep in mind. The tribes attacked, the settlers struck back, and they struck hard. And in 1864, a militia under this man, Colonel John Chivington, attacked a Cheyenne village whose leaders had come to a fort asking for protection. The villagers waved a flag of surrender and the American flag, but Chivington ignored it, saying that they would take no prisoners. Some 200 men, women, and children were massacred, and news of the event outraged people across the country. And following this attack in 1864, soldiers and Indians went to war. And in 1867, a federal commission was set up to try and end the wars on the plains to really to keep the settlers, to keep both sides safe. And the commission urged Native Americans to settle down, become farmers, and to send their children to schools. So new treaties were signed with the Kiowas, Comanches, and other Southern Plains Indians to move them onto reservations, which we talked about at the very beginning. A reservation is a limited area that was set aside for Native Americans, and these reservations were in the Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma, which the map that we're looking at right now showed the parts of Oklahoma that were divided up for each of the different nations. But the land was poor, and the nations that were moved into the Indian Territory, they were hunters, not farmers, but they knew that they had to they had to do what they could to keep peace, and really at this point they had no choice. Why did they have no choice? Well, this is one of the reasons. There was something worse to the Plains Indians than any broken treaty or any lost battle, and that would be the loss of the buffalo. The decline of the buffalo had begun before white settlers came west due to disease, drought, and destruction of their living areas. So there was a decline in buffalo population. So these outside influences started the decline, but it was really the popularity of buffalo hide robes and just pleasure hunting brought hunting parties west that ultimately decimated buffalo populations. Some nations, like the Pawnees, noticed that the buffalo population was getting smaller, but the hunt was a way of life that they really did not want to give up. But as the buffalo disappeared, so did the Plains Indians' way of life. And our first video is going to kind of review the importance of the buffalo and how the decline in the buffalo population brought an end to the Plains Indians' way of life.
Soon the hides began to pour down the Missouri River to St. Louis, and soon the railroads came. They brought gentlemen hunters who slew for so-called sport. They brought hunters who killed for tongues alone, and they brought hide hunters with their skinners. The prairies began to rot with wasted carcasses, and the Sharps' rifles fired without ceasing. Horse hunting had become too slow. To get a stand with the long-range Sharps was the wholesale way to kill. One man with one Sharps could take 3,000 in a season. By 1869, the Union Pacific Railroad had divided the buffalo into northern and southern herds. By 1873, the hide hunter campaign reached its peak in the south. The hunters and skinners now covered the plains from the North Platte to the Arkansas River. They were a raucous blend of bumped railroad workers and Civil War veterans. They liked killing, and they liked whiskey, and they could gorge themselves on hump meat and tongue. Enthusiasm for buffalo meat was legend on the plains. The roasted marrow of a buffalo's thigh bone could be cause for a wild wingding.
But if you will pay good wages, give information too, I think that I will go with you to the range of buffalo. Oh, it's now we cross these bitter woods, and homeward we are bound. No more that hell our country shall ever we be bound. Go home to your wives and sweethearts, tell others not to go. For God's forsaken the buffalo range, and the damned old buffalo. Barrel, boys! Barrel! Yeah. Here we go. I get this one over here, this one over here, and I can pour it right in. Pour it on here. Give us a bat here. Pour. Got a pour on there?
There were still great herds in the north. By 1882, the Northern Pacific Railroad was built, and 5,000 hunters and skinners were emptying the northern range. Sitting Bull led his people on their last hunt in 1883. Between the Black Hills and Bismarck, they killed 1,200 buffalo in 2 days. It was the last free herd anyone ever saw. A year later, the hunters flocked to the range as usual. They returned with empty wagons and broke. It was 1884. The days of the still hunt, the hide men, and the skinners were over. The massive herds were gone. For the Indian, the end of the buffalo meant starvation and disease. Still, he could invoke the mysterious powers of Tatonka for healing. The people still lived on the desperate hope that Tatonka would return. And for those who lived on hope alone, the medicine men became the new leaders. These were the waning moons of desolation, and the last robes wrapped the bodies of the dead.
So now many Indian nations are living on reservations, and on lands that they had been promised that would be theirs forever. So these reservation lands were promised to them and said that these are now your lands forever. But that unfortunately would not be the case as more settlers moved west. In 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills region of what is now South Dakota. Now, the problem was that this region had been promised to the Lakota Sioux for a reservation. So when thousands of miners flooded into the area, Indian warriors under Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other Lakota chiefs fought back, and this revolt became known as the Sioux War of 1876, which brings us to our buddy George Custer. So in June of 1876, Custer led a group of about 600 soldiers into the Little Bighorn Valley to protect a group of miners that were living nearby. Scouts had warned Custer that there were large groups of Lakota and Cheyenne Indians camped near where his soldiers were, so he prepared his troops to attack. But what he didn't know was that this large group of Lakota and Cheyenne was a combined force of about 2,000 warriors. Custer divided his men and only attacked with about 225 soldiers, but because of the overwhelming numbers, Custer and his men died at the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand.
But other Lakota were still willing to carry on the fight for justice and freedom. As many as 3,000 Lakota had refused to sign the 1868 treaty and continued to live in the Powder River region, designated by the U.S. as unceded Indian territory. These Lakota turned to Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, two honored war chiefs for leadership. Crazy Horse forcefully stated his people's position.
We did not ask you white men to come here. The Great Spirit gave us this country as a home. We do not want your civilization. We would live as our fathers did, and their fathers before them.
The already strained peace was shattered when gold was found in the sacred Black Hills within the boundaries of land recognized as Lakota Reservation in the 1868 treaty. Under pressure from gold seekers to seize the Black Hills from the Lakota, the United States government offered to buy the land the Lakota knew as Paha Sapa. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were opposed to selling the sacred land. But the government was not dissuaded. The religious concerns of the Lakota were not of primary concern to the settlers and prospectors pushing the government, nor were the terms of the Treaty of 1868. Newspaper editorials contributed to the climate of hostility toward the Lakota.
What shall be done with these Indian dogs in our manger? They are too lazy and too much like mere animals to cultivate the first.
There was nothing that could stir an irrational mania quite like the very hint of gold in some recess of the West. And as one of the senators commented, the American people will override every Indian tribe and every regiment of the U.S. Army to get at where the gold is, and there is no stopping them.
On December 1st, 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum to the Lakota. Come to the reservation within 60 days or be considered hostile and at war. Few Lakota paid attention to the government's threats. The mission of doing battle with the formidable Lakota was given to General Custer, a well-known and popular hero of the Civil War. June 1876. Custer and the 7th Cavalry searched the northern plains for Lakota warriors. Not far from Custer's position, warriors following Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse joined together with a large number of disappointed reservation Lakotas and bands of Cheyenne. They were encamped along a river they called the Greasy Grass. Custer and his men knew it as the Little Bighorn. June 25, 1876. A scouting party sent by Custer spotted a handful of Lakota warriors and returned to report their position. The colonel decided to launch an attack, waiting for neither scouting intelligence nor reinforcements. With fierce strategy and skill, Sitting Bull's forces engaged Custer's army in numbers much larger than the lieutenant colonel had anticipated. Outmanned, outfought, and outmaneuvered, the 7th Cavalry was defeated in less than 2 days of fighting.
The Little Bighorn, of course, was the grandest victory in all the history of hostilities, all the history of Great Plains warfare. But in that victory lay the seeds of defeat, because that was so spectacular a disaster for the U.S. Army, so stunning to the American people in this centennial year when they're celebrating 100 years of independence, that there was an immediate demand for retaliation.
And as was alluded to in the video, this victory was the beginning of the end of the Plains Indians. And after a series of defeats, and to try and avoid starvation, the Lakotas gave up most of their land in the Black Hills to the U.S. government. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse took what was left of their men and went to Canada, but eventually both men would return. And pictured here is another chief. This is Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. Now, the Nez Perce lived in the Snake River region where Oregon, Washington, and Idaho all come together. And in 1855, they signed a treaty giving part of their land to the U.S. government. But just like in the Black Hills, in 1860, gold strikes brought miners to their lands. Chief Joseph and his people fled north to Canada, but they were pursued by army troops. And after months of fighting and running, Chief Joseph decided that he must surrender because of the 800 that originally fled with him, less than 450 remained. And he is quoted as saying, "I will fight no more forever." In the Southwest, the Apache Nation continued to battle with army forces over losing their land, and one leader, this man Geronimo, fought the longest. In 1876, he took a force of Apache warriors when the government tried to force him off his land and waged war for the next 10 years. He led raids in Arizona and New Mexico, but when he finally surrendered in 1886, the war between Indians and white settlers officially ended.
While African Americans were being denied their rights as citizens, the Native Americans were being denied their right to the land. At the time of the Civil War, it's estimated that 250,000 Native Americans lived between the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. As the Transcontinental Railroad brought settlers, farmers, prospectors, miners, and cattle ranchers out west, it was clear that a clash of cultures was imminent. The Indian Wars lasted for 25 years. Though the Native Americans were often outgunned and outmanned by the U.S. cavalry, they fought valiantly to defend their homeland. Though the battles often had heavy death tolls, it was the slaughter of the buffalo by railroad workers and frontiersmen that caused the most staggering damage to the Native Americans, who depended on the animal as a chief source of food, clothing, and shelter. Those Native Americans who survived were forced to live in reservations, often in the barren lands found undesirable by frontier speculators. Some refused reservation life. In 1876, a group of Apache warriors led by Geronimo escaped from the San Carlos Reservation in eastern Arizona and began an armed insurrection. Geronimo was forced into surrendering in 1883, but he soon escaped again. Geronimo's final surrender in 1886 marked the end of the last significant Native American guerrilla action in America. By that time, Geronimo's army was composed of only 16 warriors, 12 women, and 6 children. Geronimo and over 300 of his Apache followers were forcibly shipped to Fort Marion, Florida, where he could be more easily contained. The darkest time in the Indian Wars came in 1890 in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. U.S. cavalrymen were in the process of disarming a group of captured Lakota Indians when it mistook the actions of one of them to be hostile. The cavalrymen opened fire, and when the smoke cleared, 250 Native American men, women, and children were dead. The massacre served as a symbol of the negative aspect of America's conquest of the frontier.
Now, on the reservations, many Native Americans longed for their former way of life, and many Lakotas actually turned to a religious ceremony known as the Ghost Dance, which was being spread by a Lakota prophet named Wovoka. And he stated that by doing the Ghost Dance, the Great Spirit would create a new world just for the Plains Indians. Members would join hands and chant and pray while dancing, but this dance alarmed settlers who thought that the dancers were actually preparing for war, not worshiping the Great Spirit. And out of their fear, settlers had the U.S. government outlaw the Ghost Dance.
By 1890, no Indian people anywhere in the West lived freely on their own land. And even the reservations on which they struggled to survive were being broken up under the Dawes Act. Congress had cut appropriations. Rations were drastically reduced. There were deadly epidemics of measles, influenza, whooping cough. On the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, the Lakota medicine man Sitting Bull was living quietly in his cabin. He was still regarded with respect by those Lakotas who remembered the eerie accuracy of his visions during the days when they had fought Custer. But the Lakota were divided now, as they struggled to come to terms with the white man's world. And Sitting Bull had had another, more disturbing vision. This one told him that the worst fate that could befall a Lakota awaited him: to die at the hands of his own people. That fall, Sitting Bull had a visitor, a Minneconjou Lakota named Kicking Bear, just back from a train trip to the far west and bearing remarkable news. A ceremony called the Ghost Dance was sweeping through many tribes of the West. It was part of a message of hope for all Indian peoples, being preached by a Paiute medicine man and prophet named Wovoka.
My brothers, I bring you word from your fathers, the ghosts, that they are marching now to join you. Led by the Messiah, who came once to live on earth with the white man, but was killed by them. I bring to you the promise of a day in which there will be no white man to lay his hand on the bridle of the Indian's horse. When the red men of the prairie will rule the world. Wovoka.
Wovoka's gospel of salvation was filled with Christian as well as Indian elements. Men and women were first to purify themselves and forswear alcohol and violence. Then they were to dance in a large circle, chanting and appealing to the spirits of their ancestors. When they did, Wovoka promised, the whites would vanish, the buffalo would cover the earth again.
The ghost dance, I think, was it was a desperate prayer. They thought that, well, it may be possible that all of this has been a bad dream, or all of this is passing, and there will be the restoration of the world we knew and loved.
Like most Indians, Sitting Bull remained skeptical of the ceremony's promised powers. But he agreed to let the ghost dance be taught to those people at Standing Rock who wanted to learn it. In the Lakota version of the ceremony, the dancers wore special shirts, said to be stronger than the white man's bullets.
The people wearing the sacred shirts and feathers now formed a ring. We boys were in it, all joined hands. Everyone was respectful and quiet, expecting something wonderful to happen. The leaders beat time and sang as the people danced, going round to the left in a sideways step. Occasionally someone fell unconscious into the center. As each one came to, she or he slowly sat up and looked about, bewildered, and then began wailing inconsolably.
And in December of 1890, government officials entered a Lakota reservation where Sitting Bull was living, and they charged him with spreading the ghost dance among the Lakotas, even though it had been outlawed. And during a struggle, Sitting Bull was accidentally shot and killed, and his death obviously upset many on the reservation, so they fled. Troops followed them to the Wounded Knee Creek in present-day South Dakota, and on December 29th, they prepared to surrender. While the Lakotas were laying down their guns, a shot was fired, and no one can be sure if it was on the Army side or on the Lakota side, but something happened. A shot was fired, and the Army opened fire. And when the shooting finally stopped, about 300 men, women, and children were dead, and with them died the ghost dance religion.
My grandfather's mother was one of the people who was from Sitting Bull's camp. And my grandfather would tell me that when Sitting Bull was killed, they had very few horses. So the few horses they had, they put the young children on, and they walked to Bigfoot's camp, and that she wept as she walked. And she wept not only for Sitting Bull being killed the way he was, but also wept because she feared that she would not live to have children. And if she did have children, would they be Lakota?
Sitting Bull's grieving followers fled toward the Cheyenne River Reservation, where they joined a Miniconjou band led by a chief named Bigfoot. He had once been an enthusiastic ghost dancer, but he was no longer certain that the world would be transformed. Bigfoot decided to take his band into Pine Ridge and see if there wasn't some way to reconcile things. But General Miles misunderstood what Bigfoot was doing and ordered the 7th Cavalry under Colonel John Forsyth to intercept him. They caught up with Bigfoot 3 days after Christmas. The chief was riding in a wagon, too ill with pneumonia even to sit up. But he flew a white flag to show his peaceful intentions. The soldiers transferred Bigfoot to an army ambulance and then led his band down to a little creek for the night. It was called Wounded Knee. There were 120 men and 230 women and children. The soldiers distributed rations. An army doctor did what he could for Bigfoot. But the soldiers also posted 4 cannon on the top of a rise overlooking the camp.
The following morning there was a bugle call. Then I saw the soldiers mounting their horses and surrounding us. It was announced that all men should come to the center for a talk. Bigfoot was brought out of his tent and sat, and the older men were gathered around him. Deweybeard.
Charles Allen, a reporter for a Nebraska newspaper, watched from the hilltop.
At the southeast edge of the group of standing Indians, there was a fair-sized plat of grass, where, in all the exuberance of early youth, were 8 or 10 Indian boys dressed in the gray school uniforms of that period. The fun they were having as they played bucking horse, leapfrog, and similar games carried the mind for a fleeting moment back to the days of boyhood.
Troops began moving from teepee to teepee, confiscating knives and axes from the women, sometimes seizing a rifle. A medicine man began to dance. "Do not fear," he told the warriors, "but let your hearts be strong. Many soldiers are about us and have many bullets, but I am assured the bullets cannot penetrate us."
Suddenly, scooping up a handful of dirt, he tossed it scattering in the air, and with eyes turned toward heaven, implored the Great Spirit to scatter the soldiers likewise.
Almost simultaneously with him throwing a handful of dirt into the air, soldiers tried to disarm a man who was deaf. And he hung on to his rifle, and they kind of struggled over it, and it went off. These two things happened at the same time, and bang, I mean, it just blew everything up.
The soldiers opened fire with rifles, revolvers, and finally, a cannon that hurled exploding shells into the teepees. The Lakotas did their best to fight back. When the shooting finally stopped, some 250 men, women, and children were dead.
I walked around viewing the sad spectacle. On reaching the corner of the green where the schoolboys had been so happy in their sports but a short time before, there was spread before me the saddest picture I had seen or was to see thereafter. For on that spot of their playful choice were scattered the prostrate bodies of all those fine little Indian boys, cold in death. The gunfire had blazed across their playground in a way that permitted no escape. They must have fallen like grass before the sickle.
Dead, too, were 25 soldiers. Wounded Lakotas and wounded soldiers alike were taken to the Holy Cross Episcopal Church at Pine Ridge. Its walls were still hung with Christmas decorations.
Pews were torn from their fastenings, and armfuls of hay fetched by Indian helpers. Upon a layer of this, we spread quilts and blankets taken from our own beds. The victims were lifted as gently as possible and laid in 2 long rows on the floor. A pathetic array of young girls and women and babes in arms, little children and a few men, all pierced with bullets.
A young girl who had a ghost shirt on underneath her clothes said, "They told me if I put this on, the bullets would not go through," and I believed them. Now see where we are.
Now, the forced relocation of Native Americans brought its own set of activists, both Native American and white. Reformers such as Helen Hunt Jackson and Suzette LaFlesche, who Suzette LaFlesche was actually the daughter of an Omaha chief. They both spoke out about the destruction of the Native American way of life and of the numerous broken treaties between Native Americans and the U.S. government. So, as a result of the push of reformers, Congress passed the Dawes Act in 1887, also known as the General Allotment Act, and they did so to encourage Native Americans to become farmers and divided up their lands between families. Now, the goal was to help the people become more accustomed to American life. But to Native Americans, especially the Plains Indians, land should be open for riding and hunting. So some sold their shares to whites for very low prices. And the reservations also changed Native American culture in that it took away the power of the tribal chiefs and put federal agents in charge of the important decisions. And our final video is going to talk more about the Dawes Act and how it affected Native American life.
With high unemployment, poverty, despair, and alcoholism rampant on most reservations, the government realized that the reservation system was a costly failure. Some officials felt that the problem was that the reservation land was owned by the tribe and not by individual Indians. This was the way Indians had always owned land. It was believed that if individual Indians could own their own land, they would have the incentive to farm it and raise livestock on it, as whites did. In response to growing support, the U.S. Congress passed the General Allotment Act in 1887. Under this law, each Indian head of family would be given 160 acres to do with as he wished. At first, many Indians were puzzled and amused with the whole idea of being given land that was rightfully theirs to begin with.
What we don't like about the government is their saying, "We will give you this much land." How can they give it when it is our own? We cannot understand it. They have never bought it from us or our forefathers. They say now they will give us so much land, our own land.
The amusement turned to outrage when the Indians learned more about the Allotment Act, and one feature in particular. Once the land was parceled out to individual Indians, the land that was left, in some cases as much as 90% of the original reservation, could be acquired by the government for sale to white homesteaders. So while the act was presented as something that would benefit Indians, it actually benefited whites.
The real aim of this bill is to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but the pretext to get at their lands and to occupy them. If this were done in the name of greed, it would be bad enough. But to do it in the name of humanity, and under the cloak of an ardent desire to promote the Indian's welfare by making him like ourselves whether he will or not, is infinitely worse.
The fact was that the General Allotment Act was just another land grab, another scheme to take Indian land.
In that 1887 Act, it busted up tribal holdings and took all of the tribe's land away. It was a huge land grab. It stole land. Each individual under this piece of legislation, the General Allotment Act, got 160 acres per male, per Indian male at the head of the household. And the women didn't even get any land. Only the men that would get land. And that was a violation of our Indian treaties, because you can't just simply, wipe out millions of acres without consent. So it was taking without compensation, and that's unlawful. So that was a real sad chapter in Indian history. Between those years of 1887 and 1934, we lost over 90 million acres of land that was stolen from Indian country.
As it turned out, the General Allotment Act, which was intended to bring Indians into mainstream America, was a failure. Few Indians had either the desire, the experience, or the equipment to farm their land, and most wound up leasing or selling their land to whites at bargain prices. About the only thing the act did achieve was what most Indians had feared, a further loss of Indian land. Surplus Indian land was advertised for sale on posters and in newspapers throughout the country, starting a land rush in nearly every western state. White homesteaders streamed into Indian country. Teepee villages were replaced by ranches and farms. Entire towns sprang up overnight. The West was completely transformed in just a few decades. In states like South Dakota, the General Allotment Act and others like it helped contribute to a steady erosion of Indian land, so that by the early 1900s, the once vast reservations that spanned the entire state were reduced to a patchwork quilt of small, isolated reservations. The Indians were caught between two worlds. They didn't have enough land to continue living in the old ways, and they didn't have the education or training to pursue lives elsewhere. In the 1950s, the government encouraged Native Americans to leave the poverty of reservation life and relocate to the nation's cities, where they would receive 1 month's training and a good job.
The relocation program was an effort on the part of the government to move Indians into urban areas and off of their reservations. They promised lots of things. They promised training programs, and they promised jobs. Indians were moved to places like Denver, Minneapolis, Cleveland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. But the problem was that there was very little training and even fewer jobs.
While a few Indians were successful in making the transition to city life, most of them wound up living in the same sort of poverty they had hoped to escape on the reservation. What's worse, the Indians faced prejudice in the cities from people who didn't want them there.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, once you have completed today's questions, you can either scan that completed sheet and send it to me, or if you've typed your answers, send me that Microsoft Word or LibreOffice document. Otherwise, you can type your answers into the notes box below, and this will be out of 16 possible points, so 2 points per question.